Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Things That Matter with Marty McNabb. And as many of you know, I am a personal historian and legacy artist. For over close to 30 years, I've helped people with their photo, document, and memorabilia archives, everything they've saved or inherited, create a visual narrative from those things. The end product can be a wall of frames, it can be a family website, but most of my clients have wanted a good old fashioned scrapbook because they wanted everything but the kitchen sink in there. So they had baby teeth and locks of hair and baby booties and the bracelet from the hospital. And of course, newspaper clippings and magazines and letters and cards and you name it, everything went into these things. So I absolutely love the stories that get attached to these things. So we can all agree that things don't really matter, but it's the stories that get attached to the things that matter. And so that is why I started this show. And I found that lots of people do have the same feeling about loving things and the stories that get attached to the things. So I am so grateful to have a special guest. All my guests are special, I know, but a special guest who I met through a good friend of mine, Melissa, um, and who I found, Melissa introduced me to her mom, who's actually back in Western Massachusetts, where I have a lot of history with. And she ended up first introducing me to her mom with her mom's attic, which is basically like a museum. And everything in that attic has a story. And yes, most of the stuff is Melissa's. We already talked about that. But anyway, I am delighted to have my guest today share some stories of things that matter and how these things started, how these things matter and what that has led her to do in her life. And I know there's lots of things because Trudy has been a busy woman doing lots of things in her life. But she's going to share a little bit of her personal history through a thing that matters. So without further ado, I am going to turn the floor over to you, Trudy, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Marty. This is just so much fun. So I want to talk about my collection and how I got my collection. It was about 1968. I was going to college in Lake Forest, north of Chicago. And I was at a friend's house who was living off campus. And there were, she had 3 or 4 peace buttons pinned to her couch. And I said, wow, that's really cool. And she said, I'm starting a collection. Well, you don't say collection to me without getting in trouble. So I thought, okay, I'll start a collection too. I'll start a collection of pins and buttons too. And I had a few. I had an equality button that my mom and dad got when they went to a peace march where Martin Luther King was speaking. And I had a button that said, be happy. And I had a button that said, I'm loved. And at that time, years ago, Avis Rent-A-Car had buttons that said, we try harder. And so I thought, I've already got the start of my button collection. Well, in my family, if you tell somebody you're collecting something, you are in trouble. Or if you say, I like penguins, for the next 12 years, everybody gives you every kind of penguin magnet and toy and whatever. So I made the mistake of telling people I had a button collection in my family. So I have well over 1,000 buttons. These are my presidential buttons. These are all my these are my social concerns button: peace, animal rights, homelessness. Those are those. I've got, these are all my we try harder buttons. I've got, buttons from sports teams, buttons from events that, people have got. Thousands. I have well over 1,000 buttons that I organized about a month ago into these little bags. So that's kind of part one. That's how I ended up with this collection. So I knew that I had to choose a button out of 1,000 buttons that really matters to me.
Because I couldn't have you tell every story of everyone, although I've invited you to do that. So we'll talk about that later.
I did pick out 30 buttons.
Yes.
Well, some of the buttons are from like the St. Paul, Minnesota Christmas parade. You know, they don't mean anything to me, but you know, my siblings would send them to me. And so, all right, that's story number one.
All right.
All right. You ready for story number two?
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay. Story number two. I grew up as the child of peace and social justice activists. My mom comes from a long line of ministers, all the way back to William Tyndale, who was burned at the stake for translating the Bible into English. How dare he do that, right? And my dad was a minister. And my mom and dad loved the story of this person who fed the hungry, clothed the naked, welcomed the immigrant, visit the imprisoned, loved the unlovable, wanted peace, wanted us to just go out and love. You know, that was the story they loved. And so I grew up in that environment, and I saw my parents work for peace and social justice my whole life. We moved to a small town in Kentucky when I was about 10. Schools were segregated, movie theater was segregated at the time, all the businesses were segregated, and my dad was right there on it right away. I saw him working to get that. You're not going to the movies until it's integrated, he said, you know. And he, you know, very shortly, he was a college professor at the time. Within a couple of years, they were building a new high school. They integrated the schools, the businesses, etc. My mom boycotted grapes and lettuce in support of Cesar Chavez and the migrant farm workers. So that was, and they were always going to peace marches in Frankfort, Kentucky, you know, and bringing me back buttons. So that's kind of the environment I grew up in. So it's, you know, when I'm thinking about which button to choose, I knew it had to be a button related to some kind of social justice or peace issue. So that's story number two.
Absolutely. That I knew this came from somewhere because I've known your daughter now for a couple of years, and I know she has a big activist part of herself that's really deep. So I knew it came from somewhere. So I
Right.
love hearing where her passion for activism comes from too. So thank you.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so then why did I choose the particular button that I chose? 1967, I go to college at Lake Forest College, which is north of Chicago, 30 miles north of Chicago. There is a big peace, anti-war movement going on in college, and of course, and civil rights movement was going. So those two events were happening, and I'm right there, you know, near Chicago, where everything's happening. And so I immediately got involved in particularly the anti-war movement at the time. 1969, the anti-war organizers around the country decided to have 3 days of moratorium, which meant they were asking businesses and colleges, schools to shut down in October for 1 day, in November for 2 days, in December for 3 days, in opposition to the war. So the October moratorium was, we all went into Chicago, at Washington, D.C., San Francisco, all over the place. And that was very peaceful. And then we had the November moratorium. It was one of the biggest, there were 500,000 people in Washington, D.C., a couple 100,000 in Chicago, a couple 100,000, I mean, all over the place. Well, at this time in Chicago, we have the police, well, we have Mayor Daley,
Mm.
who, after Martin Luther King was assassinated and there were some riots, he says, shoot to kill any protesters, right? You had the violence at the Democratic National Convention in the summer of 1968. So you've got the police at the ready, right? And so we're having this peaceful march asking for peace, and suddenly the police start bashing people in. And that night on the TV, I saw one of my friends being dragged by the hair across the plaza, and it was just a really we never even ended the march. We never got to hear any speakers because there was so much violence there. We all went in Chicago. We went back again the next week, and Mayor Daley knew there better be no violence then. But okay, so it is my November moratorium march button that is so important to me. But I have recently learned in the last month or so that it is these moratoriums, with the amount of public opposition to the war, that turned the war. What Nixon apparently had thought about using nuclear bombs in Vietnam. And there's some classified information that's recently been declassified. And the reason he didn't because he saw how many people spoke out. Wow. And that was really those events, so that November moratorium particularly was the turning point for Nixon. And he slowly started pulling troops he hated the Vietnam War, and he hated the protesters because it was upsetting and disrupting his administration and making him look bad. And it was this November moratorium where he started beginning to think about pulling troops out, moving towards the end of the war, which wasn't for another 3 years or so. But that was a pivotal event in his mind. The fact that people spoke out. So I also have, of course, my October moratorium button and my December moratorium button, but this is the November one, because the November one was just so memorable in my mind. I mean, when you go to a march, we went to a march the following week, everybody's putting Vaseline on their face because maybe there's going to be tear gas again, and having your red bandanas to cover you up. And, it just, anyway, this is the march that said to me, we got to speak out. No matter what, anytime people organize for a social justice peace issue, change is going to happen. Maybe not right away, but eventually policy change is going to happen. So that's why I chose that particular button.
Yeah, very powerful. It's it kind of brings me back because my aunt was a nun. Well, both aunts on my dad's side were nuns, and one of them went to all the marches, the peace marches, the anti-nuclear, the anti-war marches. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge is to end up realizing that it takes time as well, but that doesn't mean that you don't they didn't know when they were going to do the moratorium, they didn't know that was going to turn things. They just did it anyway. They
exactly
do it anyway. So that's
right. Exactly.
Powerful
that's actually that idea of why do we do this? We do it because we have to.
Yeah.
We do it because it's the right thing to do to speak out against injustice, right?
Absolutely.
And you don't know what the result is going to be, but if enough people are speaking out, then you're going to get some results at some point.
Yeah. Even if it takes way longer than we want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Very, very, very neat. So yes, just a little preview for my listeners. So one of the new services that I'm offering is kind of private show and tells. So for people who have collections like Trudy does, that it's so much like Judy that I'm saying it my way. But anyway, that Trudy has a collection, and I have a couple of friends who have weapons, and so I know, like, but he inherited a lot from his father, who
Mhm.
inherited, it's a similar thing,
Ex-
and it,
Exactly.
so yeah, so it's not like an arsenal, let's say, but it's
Uh-huh.
like, just something that got passed down from generation to generation. So
Mhm.
I love helping people tell the stories of what we say, your life in 30 things, or your life in 30 buttons, or your life in 30 weapons. It's kind of juxtaposition between the buttons, the peace buttons, and my friend who has all the weapons. But
I know, I know,
anyway,
I know. Yeah,
I
right,
think
right.
it's beautiful. It shows the diversity of people, and I think that Robert is very much pro peace. Um,
Right, right, right.
Came from a family that they hunted, and they
Mhm.
it was everyday things. So anyway, you hopefully will have some more little stories about the other buttons you have, but I think
There's 1,000 of them. There's a
there's
thousand.
thousands of
I don't-
I don't know if we need the rental car thing, but
Oh, that's the best
but
story. I have "We Try Harder" buttons from Avis Rent a Car in every single language.
I think
See,
that's so
see,
interesting that was
yeah.
the
So
tagline.
anyway, but yeah,
I love it. It's sort of like the same thing with the peace and stuff. We try harder. I
right, 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 right,
perfectly aligned, right?
right.
So I know that, like I did hear a little bit about your father, that was the pastor, and
Mm,
that you have this wonderful collection of his sermons and things
mhm.
like that as well. So I know you've got lots that you're up to and lots that you do, but I did hear that based on your buttons actually are the basis of something that's very exciting that I want my listeners to find out about. That is, these buttons inspired you to, and I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to hand it back over to you, Trudy.
Okay. So inspired me, and I was inspired probably 35 years ago. I was working with a group in Tennessee called Cumberland Countyans for Peace, and we were about 10 years out from the Vietnam War, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, we are still marching. We're still speaking out. What is wrong with people?" And I began to think about how the Vietnam War really defined my generation, right? That every single male that I knew had the threat of being drafted and sent to Vietnam over his head, every single one of them. And so whether they were going to volunteer or be drafted or go to jail or go to Canada or shoot up drugs or become very fat, because if you were if you were really obese, or whatever, they had to make this decision. um,
Yes.
I could do whatever I want. I could say, "Burn your draft card." Yeah, because I wasn't going to be drafted.
Right.
Right. And yet that war affected me because it affected every single person in my generation. And I think when you think about the 60s generation, there's that kind of angst. There was this kind of live it, and live it hard because you don't know. So at that time, 35 years ago, I wanted to write a book talking about how the war affected my generation.
Mhm.
35 years later, I finally self-published this book. And of course, in that 30, it was sat in a box for 25 years
Mhm.
because, and then when I got it out of the box, I went, "Oh my God, this is so poorly written." It was so terrible. And I went to many writing groups, many critique groups, many mentors who helped me, finally came up with my final copy. It's called Radishes and Red Bandanas. And I talked a little bit about how we wore red bandanas.
Yes.
Everybody in the 60s had red bandanas in their belt loops or on their faces or around the hair or whatever.
Yes.
Um, and and in the book, it kind of changed a little bit in in the message that I was trying to get out. And ultimately, it's all about the importance of speaking out. I mean, this book takes place during the 1960s. It does take place, the setting is Lake Forest College. It is not autobiographical, although my children refuse to read it because they're like, I think that's you, Mom. And I'm going, no, it's not autobiographical. But I wanted to place it in a place near Chicago because I knew the events that happened in Chicago. And about how important it is, even when it's hard, even when you get arrested, even when you get hit by the police, you have to speak out. That's just, the important piece. And so it is about how that war affected my generation. It's also about the importance of speaking out. And it's also because I love Hallmark movies, everything has to have a love story associated with it, right? So it's about how the love of family, the love of friends, can get us through any tragedy. That's what we have to hold on to when things are rough. And so that's what the story's about. I love this story. The moratoriums are in there. The beatings at the moratoriums are in there. Anything. So just, oh my gosh. Anything, I had to condense some events because my first edition, it was like this happened and this happened, then we did this protest and we did this and this and this, and it just got a little bit, but that's what it's about. It's about how we have to speak out, and I'm seeing that more and more, in the shortly before I started this book, I was in Oklahoma City. And we were protesting the building of a nuclear power plant near Tulsa. And because of the protest, it is the first nuclear power plant that was under construction that stopped because of the protest. Wow. So that really, that inspired me also, thinking about what we had done there.
Yep.
What we had done in the 60s. And now hearing about Nixon's wanting to use nuclear weapons, I think we really did a big thing. So that's what it is. Radishes and red bandanas. Both the radishes and the red bandanas represent I don't know, healing for these people. Yeah. When times were tough, somebody gave this main character a radish, and it just, kind of healed her heart that tiny little bit. So
wow, it's very powerful, and like we had spoken about a little bit ago, it really, I was involved in work against the Atlantic Yards project in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn. And although the project moved through in a way that we didn't want, there were some concessions that were made, and during that process of fighting for the reasonable development and having a good solid urban plan,
right,
except for money, which is not a plan, it taught me a lot about what other people have done. And I think that's the biggest thing, that the most important message of that time, the time that you lived in. And my experience, like I marched during gay pride marches. I did LGBT rights ones,
right.
And I guess the biggest thing that you get frustrated because things don't always turn out your way, or the right way, the way that you feel is the most equitable, all of that. But you end up hearing about these stories of just being consistent and persistent and generous, these little ways of showing up, speaking out, using your voice, and that it can make a huge difference. So
right.
that's a powerful message, Trudy, to to share with the world. And I totally understand about the 35, how, 35 years later, you did have a lot of life in those 35 years.
Right. Well, I actually,
Have to
yeah,
pass the time.
I started teaching at a college, and I was writing professional education books and professional journal articles, and I had to put fiction aside.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
But there's one piece of this book that I forgot to talk about. Interspersed throughout, so the story is four years in the life of this woman in college.
Yeah.
Interspersed with that are vignettes of the Occupy Wall Street movement 40 years after she graduated. So her 40 years after she graduates from college, her son is involved in Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, wow.
And so I wanted to connect what happened in the 60s to the fact that the children
Yep.
of the people who lived through the 60s, like Melissa and my other kids, are marching today, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's, against the invasion in Afghanistan, Iraq, whatever,
Right.
that they are Ukraine, and that they're still marching. So I always say about this book, if you want to know what your moms were doing during the 60s, or what your grandmas were doing during the 60s, or if you want to relive the 60s yourself, it's a great book.
Wonderful. Well, I will look forward to reading it myself. And it was you did such a great job with the radishes thing, because I was just sort of like, I understood the red bandana, but I didn't, but you already, without me having to ask you, you already talked about that and how it gave her some sort of, relief and resilience kind of thing. Like, it's going to be okay. And I love, of course, you exude, and your family exudes, the sense of connection and community, and love helps us through these difficult times. And and that was what I felt from it's like I got a chance to spend some time with my aunt today, Trudy, because she talked so passionately about that time as well. And people, she said the Pope was, spoke at, well, not the Pope, but the Archbishop spoke at her funeral, and he talked about how they wanted to move. They had moved the nuns into an apartment in the projects in Albany. And they there was a period of time, the unrest, that they were really worried, and they basically contacted them and said, you have to move out. We are worried about you, and we don't want you there. And my aunt and the other nuns were like, no, make things better. We're not leaving. Make things better for everybody. Don't pull us out. And anyway, so she was always that kind of like, you just have to do what you can do. And anyway, I am so grateful to Melissa for connecting me with you, and I look forward to hearing more stories of more buttons. And I thank you for specifically bringing this very important button that changed world history, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's the whole beauty, is that these little objects, can have such big epic stories connected to them.
Right.
So that is, like I've been telling people lately, it's like, what's historical societies or museums other than great big show and tells?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Right.
And having personal objects like you have. I mean, I have often invite people to consider, and I don't know if you've had a chance, but I think that this is, in closing, we can do is, have you thought about who's going to inherit or be gifted your collection? 'Cause it's not, it's valuable. It's only, piece, metal and topography and whatever, but they're valuable pieces of our history. So have you thought about that at all, Trudy?
Well, I've thought about all the junk I have in my house, right? So my husband and I have 5 kids, and the only two who would be interested in any of this would be Melissa and my daughter Rachel. And the two of them will fight over, you know, fight over who gets the photos of mom's trip around the world, who gets this, who. And so I want my kids to come in the house and mark what they want. So there's no
Right.
fighting about it.
No fighting.
But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Um,
also thinking like a piece, if there, any museum or historic or anything that's devoted to peace, would love. And obviously the Avis has to have some sort of
yeah,
archive, because
right.
we assume that these big organizations have an archive or hold
Right,
on to
right.
things, but they don't necessarily. And
Mhm.
so maybe they're like realizing history is so important for everybody now. Everybody's much
Right.
more connected to it. So maybe Avis would want those buttons
Then if
down the road.
yeah.
Who knows,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. One of my rules about the buttons is that I can never buy one.
Ah,
What? Yeah, and one of the problems with political campaigns now is that they hand out stickers that you stick on your shirt, right?
right. And
And
not
then
buttons.
and you can go to their website and buy their buttons. So, it makes it hard. I don't
Right.
have a Biden Harris button. I mean, there's a lot of buttons I don't have. And
Right.
because I
Yeah,
and I had forgotten it until
that's the
today
rule.
that was my rule. Yeah, I'd forgotten it until today, so I need to go back to my
But
rule.
that's a good rule to have. That limits things, right?
Right, I still have 1,000 buttons because people
Yeah,
kept sending them to me, so.
giving them to you.
Right,
So
exactly,
yes,
exactly.
yes. So
So, by the way, the book
story
is
gets
at,
out. I'm like,
I would
maybe if the story goes out on podcast or YouTube, anybody who has a Biden
Harris button could send
Harris
me one.
button can send Trudy one. We'll
I
put
will send them a copy of this book for free if they send me a Biden Harris.
Oh, okay. See,
All
this
right.
can get you the buttons that you want. I'm glad I asked.
No, only the Biden Harris. That's
Only
the
the
only
Biden, right?
Yeah, I don't need any more. I don't need anything else. So
Okay,
anyway,
just that one. If you send it, you'll get your own copy.
you'll get your own autographed copy. Amazon, it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble website, a few other places. So
Great. And I will have all of this information in the show notes. But also, is there anywhere else that people can find you? Do you have a website? Are you on any social
yes,
media? How do people
yes.
find you?
My website is just www.trudyknowles.com.
All right.
And my email is trudyknowles@gmail.com. So it's all pretty easy.
All pretty easy. I will.
And I do want to say, if you go into Amazon and put in radishes and red bandanas, you will get a whole bunch of advertisements for red bandanas. So you have to make sure you're looking for books and not just general stuff, unless you want to buy some red bandanas. So
no, that was good, because I had somebody on who had what's her Retirement Rebel is the name of her book, and there's another book by the same name.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But anyway, it was kind of funny to have these. And she's like, oh, but by Siobhan, Daniel.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we got to clarify that. So yes. So we did it, and I'm like looking over my shoulder because I have a friendly dog who's decided to come and snuggle up on the couch here.
Oh,
But
that's sweet.
yeah, but anyway, thank you so much, Trudy, for sharing your story of the thing that matters. And thank you everyone for listening or watching this episode of Things That Matter with Marty McNabb. So I want to invite, many of you know already, but I want to invite anybody to come to one of my live virtual show and tales. I have them monthly. I have 24 different themes. So there's one theme that I'm sure you can relate to. And please tell your friends and family about it. I'm also available for your your wedding, your rehearsal dinner. Basically weddings are like family reunions now. Everybody gets together. Why not offer a story sharing gathering for everybody to get to know you better and one another better, to celebrate your wedding. Also team building, employee appreciation, even student orientation or new employee orientation. Any way that where you're trying to build connections, community, and legacy. So you can reach out to me. That will be in the show notes. And lastly, if you're looking for a unique way to market your business, and that feels good and does good, I have just opened a community, what I call of weirdos, where every individual remembers doing original stuff, is what it stands for. And people who don't do traditional marketing very, very easily, very well. If you're looking I have a community where I will teach you how to host your own show and tales as a way to build connections and grow your business. So reach out to me about that. And otherwise, this is the end of this episode. And I thank you once again, Trudy, for joining me and sharing the story of a button that matters.
Thank you, Marty. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you.